Why Elvis Presley's Graceland attic stayed locked for 48 years. Introduction. There's a room at Graceland that even Elvis Presley's own family avoided for nearly half a century. It isn't marked on the standard tour map. It isn't mentioned in the gift shop brochures. For 48 years, the attic above the mansion's second floor sat completely sealed, untouched by cleaning crews, tour guides, or even the Presleys themselves. When it was finally opened, what was inside wasn't clutter or forgotten furniture. It was something far more personal, a private record of a man who seemed to know, long before anyone else did, exactly how his story was going to end. Today we're walking through the real history behind that locked door, the questionable circumstances of Elvis's death, a bizarre attempt to sell Graceland out from under his family, and finally, what investigators found when they climbed those stairs for the first time since 1977. The house that became a legend. Elvis Presley bought Graceland in 1957 when he was only 22 years old and already one of the most famous entertainers on the planet. The purchase price at the time was a little over $12,000, a modest sum by today's standards, but a serious investment for a young man who'd grown up with very little. He kept the estate's original name rather than renaming it after himself, which says something about how he saw the place from the very beginning, not as a monument to his own fame, but simply as home. In its early years, Graceland was full of life, in most literal sense. The property included horses, stables, and even a mischievous pet chimpanzee that Elvis would dress in tiny outfits and bring along to gatherings, much to the amusement and occasional alarm of his guests. As Elvis's fame grew heavier, so did his need for a retreat within his own home. In the mid-1960s, he built a meditation garden on the property, a quiet space with fountains and white columns where he could sit and think, far removed from the chaos of stardom. It stood in sharp contrast to some of the more theatrical parts of the house, like the shag-carpeted lounge that became one of Graceland's most recognizable rooms, or the underground den where he could watch multiple television broadcasts at once, a novelty at the time. All of that changed in August of 1977, when Elvis died in an upstairs bathroom at just 42 years old. Graceland stopped being simply a family home that day. It became something closer to a shrine, and almost immediately, it became the center of controversy that would follow the Presley name for decades. A grief that never got to settle. In the days after Elvis's death, roughly 100,000 people traveled to Memphis to say goodbye, lining the streets outside the gates. His funeral procession included a line of white Cadillacs and drew some of the biggest names in entertainment and politics of the era. He was laid to rest beside his mother, Gladys, at a cemetery across town, and for a brief moment, it seemed like his family might finally be allowed to grieve privately. That didn't last. Only 2 days after the funeral, a group of men attempted to break into the cemetery and steal Elvis's body from the tomb. They were caught before they could succeed, but the damage was already done, not just to the crypt itself, but to the sense of safety his father, Vernon, had been desperately trying to hold on to. Rattled by the attempt, Vernon made the decision to have Elvis and Gladys quietly reburied within the grounds of Graceland itself, inside the very meditation garden Elvis had built for peace and reflection. That decision changed the character of the entire estate. What had been a private home slowly transformed into something closer to a fortress. Security was increased. Alarm systems were installed. And access to the home's second floor, including the attic above it, was cut off entirely, even after the mansion was opened to the public in 1982. Tour guides gave the same explanation for decades. The upstairs was private out of respect for the family. Millions of visitors walked through the ground floor over the years, admiring the stained glass and the gold records lining the hallways, but the staircase leading up remained roped off the entire time. No press cameras, no family interviews. No exceptions, not even for visiting dignitaries. It became one of the most enduring mysteries in American pop culture, a locked door that nobody, not even Elvis's own relatives, seemed willing to open. The uncomfortable truth behind his death. While the attic kept its secrets locked away physically, the real story of how Elvis died was hiding in plain sight for years, buried underneath an official explanation that most experts now agree was incomplete at best. On the afternoon he died, Elvis had been living the kind of reverse schedule that had become normal for him in his final years, sleeping through the day and staying awake through the night, sometimes for days at a stretch, before crashing into an exhausted, medicated sleep. When he was found unresponsive in his bathroom that afternoon, his road manager attempted CPR while paramedics rushed to the scene, but by the time he reached the hospital, there was nothing more that could be done. That evening, the county medical examiner told the public that Elvis had died of a sudden heart arrhythmia, describing it simply as natural causes. For a lot of people at the time, that was the end of the conversation. But even then, there were signs that something more complicated was going on. Elvis's weight had climbed dramatically. In his final years, his live performances had become increasingly erratic, and those closest to him had watched his health decline in ways that didn't line up neatly with a simple, sudden cardiac event. The full autopsy told a different story than the public statement did. It showed serious internal damage consistent with years of heavy prescription drug use, an enlarged heart, liver damage, and other signs that pointed toward chronic overuse of medication rather than an isolated natural occurrence. Toxicology results, which weren't released to the public at the time, reportedly showed a long list of powerful prescription drugs in his system, the combined effect of which almost certainly played a role in his death. At the center of that story was Dr. George Nichopoulos, known to almost everyone as Dr. Nick, who had served as Elvis's personal physician for a decade. Records later showed that in just the final 8 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick had written prescriptions for thousands of pills, a rate that worked out to roughly 1 new prescription every day and a half. His defense, when the case eventually went to trial, was that Elvis had a number of legitimate medical issues, including chronic pain from an old injury and other conditions that required ongoing treatment. He also argued, somewhat controversially, that by supplying the medication himself, he was actually protecting Elvis from seeking drugs through far less controlled and more dangerous channels. A jury ultimately found Dr. Nick not guilty of the criminal charges brought against him, but the medical board wasn't finished. Years of additional scrutiny followed, and in 1995, nearly 2 decades after Elvis died, Dr. Nick's medical license was permanently revoked. The story took an unexpected turn decades later when a researcher published findings suggesting Elvis may have carried a genetic condition affecting his liver and lungs, along with a weakened immune system that could explain many of the health problems he battled throughout his life. If that theory holds up, it complicates the popular narrative considerably, suggesting that at least some of what looked like self-destructive behavior may have actually been a man quietly struggling with health issues that doctors at the time didn't fully understand. A bizarre attempt to take Graceland away. Nearly 50 years after Elvis's death, Graceland found itself at the center of an entirely different kind of controversy, one that had nothing to do with old secrets and everything to do with an audacious modern scheme. In the spring of 2024, an obscure company that almost no one had heard of before filed paperwork attempting to force the auction of Graceland itself. According to the filing, Elvis's granddaughter, Riley Keough, who had taken over management of his estate after her mother Lisa Marie Presley passed away in 2023, had defaulted on a multi-million-dollar loan secured against the property. The news spread through fan communities almost instantly, triggering a wave of confusion and panic among people who had spent their lives visiting and following the estate. Keough's legal team moved fast, filing an emergency motion to halt the sale and arguing that the entire claim was built on fraud, that Keough had never signed any agreement with the company in question, and that the signatures on the loan documents appeared to be forged entirely. With the auction date rapidly approaching, a Tennessee judge ultimately intervened just 1 day before the sale was scheduled to happen, blocking it outright and describing Graceland as an irreplaceable piece of American cultural history. Notably, no representative from the company attempting to force the sale ever showed up in court to defend the claim, and the case quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Graceland remained in the Presley family's hands, but the episode was a stark reminder of just how much interest, both legitimate and predatory, still surrounds Elvis's legacy nearly 5 decades after his death. The rumors that refused to die. Long before this most recent controversy, Graceland had already become the epicenter of one of the strangest and most persistent conspiracy theories in celebrity history, the idea that Elvis never actually died in 1977 at all. The rumors started almost immediately. Within hours of his death being announced, stories began circulating about a man resembling Elvis boarding a flight out of the country under a name he'd occasionally used while traveling. Within weeks, other sightings started popping up across the country, from grocery stores to gas stations to fast food counters, each one adding fuel to a growing cultural phenomenon. By the end of the decade, reported sightings numbered in the hundreds, and the phenomenon became popular enough that a national tabloid eventually created a running column dedicated entirely to tracking new claims. Believers pointed to a handful of unusual details to support their theories: an oddly heavy casket, an unexplained decision to close the casket after already holding a public viewing, and most famously, a misspelling of Elvis's middle name on his original gravestone. To skeptics, these were simple explanations for ordinary circumstances. To believers, they were proof that something didn't add up. The theories only grew stranger with time, eventually including claims that Elvis had secretly cooperated with federal investigators and been placed into witness protection, or that he'd faked his death entirely to escape the unbearable pressure of global fame. Even now, decades later, small pockets of the internet continue to debate where Elvis might really be, whether he's living quietly under an assumed identity, or whether he still visits Graceland from time to time completely unrecognized. For the Presley family, these theories have always presented an impossible dilemma. Push back too hard and it looks suspicious. Say nothing, and the rumors only grow larger. What often gets lost in the noise, though, is a much simpler and more painful truth. Elvis's death wasn't some elaborate escape plan. It was very likely preventable, the result of a system around him that failed to protect his health properly. The wild theories about him faking his death may be entertaining, but they conveniently take the focus away from the people who arguably let him down. What was finally found upstairs? After the failed auction attempt, Riley Keough made a decision that no one in her family had ever been willing to make before. She authorized a small team of archivists to finally open the sealed attic and formally document what had been locked away since 1977. On a cold January morning, the team climbed the narrow staircase leading to the space above the mansion's second floor for the first time in nearly 5 decades. The air inside was thick with undisturbed dust, and a single bulb illuminated a room that had clearly been organized with real intention. Rather than a chaotic storage space, the attic had been carefully divided into labeled sections, each one representing a different chapter of Elvis's life: his childhood in Tupelo, his earliest recordings, his time in the Army, his Hollywood years, his legendary comeback special, and his later Las Vegas residencies. One box, simply labeled with the year of his death, sat apart from the rest. Among the items uncovered was a worn, one-eyed teddy bear that had belonged to Elvis as a young boy, patched together using scraps of fabric from his mother's own clothing during a period when the family had very little money. Archivists also found a heavily worn Bible that Gladys had given her son when he left for the Army, its pages filled with his own handwritten notes and underlined passages, including a marked passage dated just days before he died. A signed high school yearbook offered a glimpse of a shyer, more uncertain young man than the confident performer the world would come to know. Personal items from his film career hinted at how uncomfortable Elvis sometimes felt inside his own fame, while a collection of books on spirituality and philosophy suggested a much deeper, more searching side to him than his public image ever fully captured. Perhaps most striking of all was a sealed medical file from several years before his death, referencing serious heart concerns and recommending significant lifestyle changes, advice that, tragically, went largely unheeded in the years that followed. Lisa Marie Presley reportedly knew what was hidden in that attic for most of her life, but chose to honor her father's wish for privacy while she was alive. It wasn't until after her own passing that Riley Keough decided the time had finally come to document what was inside, even if not everything would ever be shared publicly. A home built on contradictions. What makes Graceland such an enduring subject, decades after Elvis's death, is how many contradictions live inside its walls. It's a house that was at various points a lively home full of exotic pets and late-night parties, and also a place of quiet retreat where its owner searched for meaning far from the spotlight. It's a mansion covered in flashy, over-the-top interior design choices that became instantly iconic, sitting just steps away from a plain, unadorned attic that held some of the most emotionally significant objects of Elvis's entire life. Even the security measures added after his death reflect that same tension. A family trying to protect their privacy and grief while simultaneously opening their home to millions of paying visitors every year, turning private mourning into a permanent public attraction almost against their will. That contradiction extended to the way Elvis was remembered by the wider public as well. To much of the world, he was larger than life, a cultural phenomenon whose face appeared on merchandise, whose music defined an era, and whose sudden death felt too big and too strange to accept at face value, which is likely part of why so many conspiracy theories took root so quickly. But inside that attic, none of that mythology was on display. There were no rhinestones or gold records up there. Just a childhood teddy bear, a worn Bible, a high school yearbook, and a handful of deeply personal items that told the story of an ordinary, complicated man who happened to become one of the most famous people who ever lived. That gap between the public legend and the private reality is really what the locked attic represented all along. Not a secret meant to shock the world, but a boundary meant to protect the parts of Elvis that fame never had a right to touch. why this story still matters. In the end, the locked attic at Graceland wasn't hiding a scandal or an escape plan. It was holding something far more human, the personal archive of a man who seemed to understand, well before his death, exactly how the world would remember him, and who quietly took steps to preserve the parts of his story that fame never fully allowed him to share. Combine that with the questionable circumstances surrounding his death, the decades of persistent conspiracy theories, and a shockingly bold modern attempt to seize his family's home entirely, and it becomes clear that Elvis Presley's story didn't end in 1977. It's still unfolding, nearly 50 years later, one locked door at a time.